Welcome to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. You can visit Dr. Johnson's blog at benwoodpost.com. Dr. Johnson's works can be found at drbenwoodjohnson.com. You can also support Dr. Johnson on Patreon, the link to which is in the description. Hey, welcome to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. Today is September the 24th, 2018, and this is podcast number 17. We are still talking about Jean-Paul Sartre. Today we're going to be talking a little bit deeper and more detail about the philosophy of Jean-Paul Sartre. We have been talking about Jean-Paul Sartre for the last four installments, but today we're going to sort of delve into the crux of his philosophy. We're going to be talking about phenomenology. We're going to be talking about the concept of the look, as Jean-Paul Sartre would say. It is a way for the being or for the individual to objectify the other, and at the same time it is a response to the objectification of the other. So today we are going to get into what Sartre means by the notion of the for itself. It's this idea that the individual is able to sort of look at the self and try to make a differentiation between the self and others, in terms of there's I, there's you, there's us, and there's we, and there is them, okay? And there's it as well. So without further ado, let us delve right into it. Over the last few posts, I have talked about Jean-Paul Sartre and his philosophy. I have talked about bad faith. I have talked about the power of the mind. I have talked about the concept of the for itself and the in itself. Now, many of you may be asking yourselves at this point, what is the philosophy of Jean-Paul Sartre? What is that philosophy about? Today we're going to be talking a little bit about that philosophy. We're going to be talking a little bit about the fundamentals of that philosophy. Now, Jean-Paul Sartre had a philosophy that was somewhat peculiar to the way other philosophers of his era approach certain questions, particularly the question of human ontology. And that approach has been based on the concept of phenomenology. Now, what is phenomenology, you might ask? Well, phenomenology is a description of the way things are. That is why Jean-Paul Sartre is considered a philosopher of reality, a philosopher of the things that we live in our day-to-day. Okay? But Sartre wanted to get out of the stasis. And by stasis, it's this idea that things are a certain way and they are always going to be that way. Sartre wanted to stay away from there, or at least he wanted to get out of this notion. From his perspective, things are constantly changing, constantly evolving. The Sartrean philosophy is a philosophy of change, okay? That is to say, we are on the move. And as a result, the philosophy of Jean-Paul Sartre is a philosophy that is constantly evolving, that is constantly changing, because Sartre has adapted his understanding of the being based on the realities of the being. Sartre argues that we need not find a psychological explanation. Rather, we need to find an ontological understanding of things. So in other words, it is not important to decipher what we perceive things to be. It is not important to understand what our subconscious is telling us. Okay, what's important is to have an ontological understanding of what we understand of our reality. By the Sartrean understanding, what matters is what fundamentally people are about in their life as a being or as beings. Okay? So when you know somebody or when you know someone, you have to be able to decipher some empirical data about that individual. So Sartre says that there is a unified way of looking at a person. There's something fundamental about the individual, something real, intrinsic about the being, which any other being could decipher. Okay? In other words, it doesn't matter whether you are X or Y, whether you are a man or a woman, whether you are a child or an older person. There's something fundamental about the being that can be deciphered. But we have to understand that the being is also evolving over time. So we have to take that into account in terms of what the being is and what the being could be in relation to the evolution of the being in his or her reality. Sartre thinks that that's what we call the original choice. Life is a strategy, so you live life as a strategy. Everything the person does is based on an understanding of his or her reality. Everything that the individual does or omit from doing is based on an original choice. It is a basic way of life, okay? It is a desire to be, right? But within that context, there are three levels of analysis one could use to decipher the individual, the being, so to speak. There is the empirical factor, there is the original choice, and there's also the desire to be, okay? But the desire to be, it's a failure. In other words, the being is always going to want to be a certain way. But that in and of itself is going to be a failure, which the being will never achieve, okay? But it is this idea that when we're talking about the concept of stasis versus a volatility for change, okay? So it is an existential psychoanalysis of a way for people to move out of bad faith, okay? So as a result of that, the individual must also be aware of the existence of others, okay? In the existence of others, where we're going to have the subject and the object, okay? And when we're talking about the subject, we're talking about not aware of the self, okay? Or aware of object and the subject world, so to speak. And the object, it's a mode of object. So, in this instance, I am the one that gives value to my world. So in this instance, there's a subject to subject relationship, right? Where it's I, them, or I, it. So there's this kind of relationship between it's me, it's you, or it's me, it's them, or it's me, it's it, or whatever it is, okay? And it is that relationship that the individual is sort of aware of the existence of others. Now, the question you might be asking is whether there is a social ontology. In other words, is there a group being? Sartre talks about the individual. So from his vantage point, when we're talking about a social ontology, we're talking about an us and a we. Of course, when we're talking about the individual, we're talking about the I. Okay? And there is a clear meaning or a clear differentiation between the us and the I, or the we and the it, if you will. The us is real objective experience of a common object. So we can share experience in our lives based on something subjective. So there's no us without a them. So it's this notion of us and we, and if there's an us, there's also a them. Okay? Is there an ontological experience for the we? Well, the answer is no. Okay? There's a sense of alienation in terms of how we perceive of the world to be. Okay? Now, this understanding is somewhat, different with the Marxist approach. Okay? From the Marxist standpoint, the subject of subjectivity is a group. Okay? And there's a splinter in the individuality. Okay? And in the Marxist understanding, they do not want the people to unite. Common actions versus common thinking. And when we're talking about common actions, we're talking about the accumulated power to change things, to change realities, okay? As opposed to common objectivity, which is the basis for oppression. It's this idea that we have a common understanding of what things are, or what things ought to be. And the Marxist understanding, or at least the concept of the common action, or is somewhat different. Once we have a common objectivity, it provides a foundation for the we to become an entity in and of itself. In other words, the we becomes a subject in and of itself. Okay, so this idea that we are one, not individuals in terms of we are individuals or collective we, but we are individuals in terms of we are one. And when we speak on behalf of everybody else. Okay? And it's this dichotomy, if you will, that we have to understand in the philosophy of Jean-Paul Sartre. Because Jean-Paul Sartre, what he's saying is that, yes, there is a we, but it is not a we that is ingrained into this idea that we are one. The individual is still an entity apart from the we. Okay? And that's what gives the individual the capacity to differentiate themselves in relation to others. So even though we are, but within that context of we, there's still this us versus them. There's still this idea of I versus them, or that's that I versus it. Okay? Now, the question you might be asking is, how do I know other subjectivity exists? The way to find out whether other subjectivities exist is to experience myself as being objectified. When others objectify me, that's when I am able to know that their objectivity, their subjectivity exists. Because when they see me as the other, it is an acclamation. It is a way of telling me that they see me as the other. Thereby, from their perspective, I am the other, which suggests that they see me as an object or as an other subject. And this is how I am able to tell whether other subjectivity exists. And this idea is the fundamental of all notions that have led to oppressions, suppressions, slavery even in the world. Okay? And the fundamental of slavery is to exist for the objectification of the other. So the other sees you as an entity that is not necessarily similar to him or her. So the individual objectifies you to a point where you only exist to his or her objectification. Okay? So from your vantage point, or let's say you are a slave. So as a slave, you know the other exists. But the other in this case exists as a subject. When you are supposed to be an object and you are supposed to recognize your beingness as an object in relation to the other, which from your vantage point must be the other is the subject. So you are being objectified by the other. And that's when you know other objectivity exists. And that's when you know whether other subjectivity exists. Okay? And in this concept of slavery, is this concept of cajolation and this concept of enslavement. Okay, now we're not talking about slavery in terms of the fundamental understanding people have of slavery. We're talking about the history of slavery in the world. We're talking about this idea of taking somebody hostage, taking somebody as a slave. And Sartre defines that relationship as the look. And the look is a way to encounter subjectivity. So within that context, the individual becomes an entity that the other objectifies for X or Y reason. And the other is able to counter that subjectivity by the look. Okay? And the look is somewhat a response mechanism in which the other could counter the subjectivity of the other. To summarize, the philosophy of Jean-Paul Sartre is a philosophy of reality. Basically, Jean-Paul Sartre looks at the world based on the reality of the being. And so it's a philosophy of things, of occurrences, okay? And Jean-Paul Sartre looks at the individual, he looks at the being and tries to make sense of his reality, okay? And within that context, he is going to define, at least try to explain that reality via what we call the phenomenology, the things that describe the reality of the being, okay? So trying to understand the reality of the being by trying to understand the way things are. In doing so, Sartre is able to get a glimpse into the being in a way that, although it is evolving, but from his perspective, is a fundamental way. It's a common way of looking at the being. Although we have differences, okay, in terms of the reality of the being is different, but from his perspective, he can decipher the reality of every being by looking at the reality around the being. So, in a nutshell, this is the Sartrean philosophy. Of course, it is complicated, I understand. It is a complex philosophy. Next week, we are going to be talking about the body. Okay, we are going to talk about how Sartre understood the role the body plays in the reality of the being, how the being looks at the self, at least within the self, under his skin, to understand how the being views or perceives the world around him. So next week we're going to delve deeper into the Sartrean philosophy, and stay tuned for that.